saw. So our mediated experiences today are primarily built with digital electronic computers that have their origins in the 1940s. Much of the language and grammar of moving pictures comes from cinema that started in the very end of the 19th century. And even that is derived from photography, which has its origins in the first half of the 19th century. But if you ask people like Oliver Grell, who is a media researcher, they will point out that immersive and virtual art has existed even further back in time. And artists throughout history have long sought to create illusions of reality with whatever media they had on hand. The media often was static and it didn't interact with the viewer, but it didn't necessarily require a scientific perspective, which was developed in the Renaissance to transport the viewer. Instead, low-tech, lo-fi dynamic storytelling has always been a really powerful way to engage audiences, to connect them in deep and compelling ways. And so today, in today's talk, I will show how there is this connecting thread from the far distant past to the recent present. And I think understanding these past immersive experiences will help us understand how users experience and react to the virtual and immersive media of today. But before we begin with that history, let's define what we mean by immersion. In her 1997 book, Hamlet on the Holodeck, Janet Murray uses water as a metaphor for immersion. So as she explains, immersion using technology is like being submerged in water. The person is completely surrounded by a liquid, and you are also cut off physically from dry land and also isolated from air. The psychological experience is akin to that of being located in an alternate reality, even though you are still inhabiting the physical space with your body, the normal real space. And thus, you're not physically transported, but the immersion allows the user to be psychologically transported to this alternate reality. Defining immersion this way makes it more expansive than what is possible with virtual reality or any other media that is based on modern digital computer technologies, as I will explain. So I need to introduce the concept of presence next. Basically, any type of mediating immersive technologies or art forms can create presence, which is the feeling of being there. Or it's basically perceptually how real that immersion is. And this can happen via blocking the physical real world from your senses, as well as being so absorbed in the artificial reality that you only pay attention to it and not the real world. Researchers like Nilsen Nordahl and Serafin in 2016 have looked at all the research that has been done on immersion and how it's been defined over the years, and they come up and summarize with 3 different immersion. This is characterized by the type of technology that you use to engage a user, which can be objectively measured and quantified. So if you talk about the number of pixels in your display, or the resolution of your display, or the frame rate, or how many channels of sound, or the field of view of your simulation, those all pertain to system immersion. Next is narrative immersion, and this is characterized by how well the storytelling is done using the medium, and how well it engages the viewer, and how powerful the emotional resonance is. And we are all familiar with how powerful narrative can be, and how narrative can immerse us and transport us away from our everyday world. Next, and the final type of immersion is what they call challenge-based immersion. And this is immersion based on gameplay and the intense interactions that you can have. And again, for those of you who have lots of experience playing video games, you know that you can be so immersed that the normal world falls away and you don't notice it, and you only pay attention to what's in front of you in the game. Now, these three measures of immersion can define really any type of immersive experience, and together they can be plotted along three axes in a three-dimensional space. Now, many, if not, not all immersive experiences can be defined by all three axes. And in some cases, an immersive experience can only exist in one immersion axis. So for instance, if you read a novel or if you hear a story that's being told orally by someone else, you can be so engaged and be totally immersed in that narrative, in that story. But in neither of those cases are you using any technology to help you have a more immersive experience, nor are you using gameplay because you're not interacting with that story in any way. And then as far as an immersive experience that is all challenge-based and doesn't contain any system immersion or narrative immersion, look at trying to solve a crossword puzzle or any type of word-based written puzzle. That's something that is between you and the puzzle and your mind, and it doesn't require any extra technology to do. So from these definitions of immersion, there are a few takeaways that we can have. First, immersive experiences can be non-realistic. And we even see that with experiences that we know are very realistic. For instance, in film, watching a film can be highly immersive for many people, but it is also full of non-realistic elements like edits, such as jump cuts or fade ins and fade outs. And camera effects are also non-realistic. If you have a camera zooming in or a camera zooming out, or if you have a shallow depth of field. And all of these effects are not what we experience in real life. But audiences have learned to ignore or accept these as stylistic conventions in film, so they don't lead to a loss of immersion. And another takeaway is that narrative immersion can be more powerful than the technology-based system immersion. And again, we can go back to the storytelling example that I mentioned earlier. Reading a novel can be extremely immersive, and probably since the dawn of film adaptations, critics have probably argued that the book was far better than the movie adaptation. And that's simply because often what you can create in your mind from the narrative can be far more compelling and realistic and engaging than anything filmed in front of any camera. So with this introductory material out of the way, let's jump into the history. My history begins all the way back to the beginning of us as a species, so back to the origins of modern humans. Our ancestors, Homo sapiens, began in Africa 200,000 years ago, and they began to spread throughout the world afterwards. They were in the Middle East by 70,000 years ago. They were in Australia 65,000 years ago, and they were in Europe 45,000 years ago. In Europe, humans started populating throughout Europe by about 40,000 years before the present, and cave art also started to appear throughout the continent. One of the oldest examples of cave art is Chauvet Cave near Vallon, Pont in the Ardèche region of southern France. In this cave, which was discovered in 1994, there are signs that humans occupied the cave in two different periods, between 37,000 years and 35,000 years ago, and also between 31,000 years and 28,000 years ago. The charcoal from the artwork in the caves have been dated to be between 32,000 and about 27,000 years ago. And in these caves, there are hundreds of examples of artworks. There were petroglyphs that were scratched into the rock. There were animal figures in geometric shapes that were drawn with charcoal and red ochre pigments. And the end of the cave complex is about 400 meters from the entrance. So what that tells you is that much of these caves were in total darkness. And so artists had to work with flames in an otherwise pitch black space. And people visiting to see the artwork also had to bring fire-lit lamps with them in order to see. Now, a wonderful film that I highly recommend is Werner Herzog's Cave of Forgotten Dreams, which came out in 2011. And this documentary is about the Chauvet Caves. This documentary was made soon after the explosion in stereographic 3D films. And so this documentary was actually filmed in stereographic 3D. And I think, unfortunately, it's very difficult to see it that way, but I think it's still the best way to view the film. When you view it in 3D, it replicates the experience of seeing the artwork in person in a cave that is otherwise not open to the public. Since the artwork is deep inside the cave, again, as I mentioned before, the original humans who made the artwork and who visited the caves probably saw the artwork under the light of flickering flames and torches. And the flames could have given life to the animals, making them appear to move and to be alive. And these are all points that Herzog makes in his film. In this picture from the film, we see a depiction of a bison, but if you look closely at the legs, you'll see that it doesn't have simply 4 legs, but it actually has 8 legs. And the legs are positioned in such a way that I think they could have been drawn by a cartoonist today in our modern day life, because us viewing it from our vantage point can't help but think of motion or as being depicted by these multiple legs. In this other example, the rhinoceros to the upper right with the horn is shown multiple times. And so that is either a depiction of multiple rhinoceroses standing back to back, or one in front of another, or it's an attempt again at showing motion lines and trying to depict motion. Again, it's very difficult, I think, for modern viewers not to think that this is an attempt by a cave artist who is 30 millennia removed from us trying to depict motion. And there are, Werner Herzog describes this as being similar to frames in an animation, and he even calls this proto-cinema. In this depiction of a bison, this is drawn at the intersection of 2 perpendicular cave walls. The painter chose this spot because the shape of the surface helped reinforce the 3D form of the creature. So the face of the bison is in frontal view, and it's on one wall, and the body of the bison is in profile view, and that is on the second wall. And so this is not only an example of the artist making maximum use of the canvas. Throughout the caverns, you can see the artists using the uneven limestone walls with the relief of the walls, helping to accentuate body parts of the animals they're drawing. And another technique that the artists used was to actually etch into the stone to trace out the outlines of the animals. And these etched lines catch the light, and they cast very thin shadows, and they also highlight the animal in relief. Now, what was the purpose of the cave art? Unfortunately, there really can't be a consensus about why the cave art was drawn or created. And that's just because these artists lived many thousands of years ago, and we don't have any records as to their thoughts or as to their reasoning. There are obviously many hypotheses that anthropologists, that researchers have thought of to explain why artists did what they did, but really nobody knows for sure. And furthermore, it's also impossible to know whether we can even impose modern sensibilities and ideas about art. So for instance, many people think that this art were symbolic representations or symbolic representations of real life animals, but there are some who argue that we can't even possibly make that assumption and be certain of it, because art can be used in ways that are non-symbolic. So I think what is really interesting is that John Pfeiffer, in his book, The Creative Explosion, has come up with a really interesting and novel idea. He points out that the art was deeply buried in these caves, and so was often very inaccessible, and hence they weren't easy to see. And so perhaps the artwork is not meant to be seen every day, but instead was meant to be seen only during special occasions. And so Pfeiffer imagined that this art could be part of a special ceremony by which tribal elders used to impart knowledge to the younger generation. And if this art is used in such a ritual, then perhaps the young initiates were on something like similar to a vision quest. They could have been fasting, or they could have been undergoing physical rigors or other trials, and maybe they had their perceptions altered by hallucinogens. Using torches, the cave images were part of an early immersive experience, because the elders could control what images the young initiates saw inside an otherwise totally black cavern. If this hypothesis is true, then this art was crucial for creating a bonding experience between the young disciples, as well as being part of an initiation ceremony into the tribal knowledge that was important for keeping their society alive. So with that, let's move forward about 30,000 years from elite tribal knowledge to art that was created for another type of elite in the Roman Empire. We know that the Romans had long been interested in illusionistic painting in the 1st century BCE, and there are many wall frescoes with perspective features used as framing devices, and frescoes of landscapes were also common, although they tended to be stylized and decorative instead of being naturalistic. An exception to this is the garden room of Livia Drusilla. Livia Drusilla was the second wife of Emperor Augustus Caesar, who was the emperor of Rome. He left his first wife to be with her, and Livia ended up being the mother to his heir, Tiberius. This villa was built between 30 and 25 BCE, and it's a series of underground apartments. And the garden room is in the triclinium, which is like the dining room of the apartment complex, and it was lit by skylights from above. Since its discovery, the frescoes have been transferred to and moved and preserved at the Museo Nazionale Romano in Rome. And not all the frescoes survived history to the modern times. You can see that the ceiling portion is only in fragments, but it suggests that the painting puts the viewer inside a grotto or a cave, or perhaps underneath a pergola with hanging vines coming off the sides. If you look at the frescoes carefully, you can see a very realistic garden scene. There are clear foreground, midplane, and background elements. Closest is a path, and then there is a sort of a low wooden fence and a stone fence further away, behind which is the main garden. And there's highly realistic depictions of plants and leaves and animals. So realistic that researchers have actually identified the types of trees, for instance, spruce, oaks, pines, as well as fruiting plants. You can see pomegranates and myrtle and oleander. They can identify different types of flowers, including roses, poppies, as well as birds like doves and goldfinches. This illusion of a cool garden spot for dining is perfect decoration for an underground villa, which is a good place to hang out in, especially during a hot Roman summer. The frescoes also help emphasize the bounty of fruit and food and life in the Roman Empire, and which may subtly affirm the glories of not only the Roman Empire, but the imperial family that resided at the villa. So let's move forward another 15 centuries to another immersive art experience built for an elite. And we will still stay in Rome, but now we are visiting the Villa Farnesina, which was built by the richest man in Renaissance Rome, who was Agostino Chigi. He was a banker to the popes, and he was originally named after Emperor Augustus, but later in life, he was compared to the Roman emperor because of Chigi's patronage to the arts. Constructed between 1508 and 1511, the villa was also filled with art by prominent artists and painters, such as Raphael. The room that we're looking at is the Sala delle Prospettive, which is a salon on the second floor, completed between 1515 and 1516. And this was a room used for banquets, including Chigi's wedding. And what's remarkable about this room is that if you look at the walls, it's painted with an exterior view of Rome outside on a spring day. And if you stand at a particular vantage point, the illusion suddenly pops into view. The perspective lines of the floor tiles continue into the painting so that the real and the virtual pictorial elements share the same vanishing point. The painted depictions of marble also have the same veins that match the real marble door frames in the room. The painting shows a covered gallery or a loggia that is supported by columns, and there are other ornamental columns that are square, the pilasters around each of the physical doorways into the room. And the painted loggia transitions into a virtual balcony that overlooks the hills of Rome and the city off in the distance. Chigi's Villa Farnesina, along with Livia's Villa, are examples of immersive experiences that transport one into pleasant virtual scenes. Because of the clientele that they were constructed for, these were highly exclusive, accessible, and enjoyed only by the elite. But roughly at the same time that the Villa Farnesina was being built, immersive art experiences were starting to show up elsewhere for a wider audience in Italy. So we will travel north to the provinces of Piedmont and Lombardy, which from the 15th to the 18th century, 9 of the so-called Sacri Montes were built. And these Sacro Monte, or the Holy Mountains, were structures. Well, the very first one was built in Varallo, and it was started by a Franciscan monk, Bernardino Caimi, in 1486. And they were started because during the 15th century, war between Christendom and the Ottoman Turks made it very difficult and dangerous to make pilgrimages to Jerusalem. So instead of having Christians travel to the Holy Land, Caimi instead came up with an idea to bring the Holy Land to Europe. The Sacro Monte at Varallo has 44 chapels plus 1 basilica, with each chapel representing a different location in the Holy Land. For instance, one might represent Nazareth, another Bethlehem, and yet another Jerusalem. And there was additional artwork added by architects and artists over the following decades. And the most remarkable of these are the figures and background frescoes that were created for life-size scenes that were put into each of the chapels. Close to 1,000 life-size sculptures were created for the Sacro Monte in Varallo. These are made in wood and terracotta. The sculptures had eyes of glass that made them lifelike. They had beards and mustaches and wigs made up of horsehair. Some were dressed in real clothing. And like the Chauvet Caves, pilgrims weren't here, well, they were here during the day, but they could also venture into these scenes at night. And so in torchlight, you can imagine the figures would have danced under the flickering flames, and which would make the figures come to life at night. And depicted in these scenes were Christ's life from the four Gospels, but especially prominent were the scenes from the Passion, his last days on earth. This included his entry into Jerusalem before Passover, when the people proclaimed him as the Messiah, the events leading up to and including the crucifixion, and finally the subsequent resurrection. 16th century accounts can be found in devotional manuals and also in tour guide materials that were used by the monks. And we learned that pilgrims took rooms at the Sacro Monte. Each day was spent fasting. They were spent in meditation as well as prayers. And they also visited chapels that were matched with the theme of contemplation for each particular day. There was a final confession on the last day and a final act of purification. And all this was to bring together a culmination of all the physical and psychological stress that was involved in undergoing this pilgrimage to the Sacro Monte. Here is a picture of the scene of Christ laying in his tomb. And from the records, we can actually learn what it was like for a pilgrim to experience this. Because not only did they see this, but they were led along a path to see other scenes. So after leaving this particular scene, they would then see a painting of the resurrected Christ. And as they moved along, they would see Mary Magdalene kneeling and weeping. And then after leaving the sepulchre, the pilgrim would see an angel telling Mary Magdalene that Christ had risen. And so during this process, the pilgrim has seen and has personally witnessed the resurrection of Christ firsthand, and he would have done so before Mary Magdalene, which would have been a powerful experience. And so in all this was not just passive observations, but actually active participation to make the pilgrims believe that they were actual witnesses to these biblical events. And the pilgrims also participated in Christ's suffering. They flagellated themselves, they beat themselves, they wept, they touched the statues. The Franciscan friars leading the tours would ask the pilgrims to imagine the sounds of the scene. So for instance, the hammers hitting the nails as Christ was being crucified. And writers wrote about how even highly sophisticated and educated visitors could be overwhelmed by this experience. So obviously everything at the Sacro Monte was a simulation of an actual pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Yet this mediated experience was able to engage the pilgrims at a very deep and spiritual level, and perhaps create an experience that was just as good, if not even better, than an actual pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So let's move forward to a few more centuries to an immersive experience that, instead of being religious in nature, is much more secular. And this next experience is the panoramic painting, which was invented by Robert Barker in 1787, where it first showed up in Edinburgh, and it later, a few years later, made its way to London in 1789. And panoramas were enormous paintings housed inside dedicated buildings with immense circular rooms to immerse viewers, to make them feel as if they were viewing and visiting a different location than where they were. Early panoramas evolved quickly from showing 180 degrees to a full 360-degree circular view. The panoramas had lots of tricks to make you believe that you're being transported to another location. Visitors would walk through a darkened corridor that would hide the previous physical location, the exterior that they were coming from. They would walk up a winding staircase, and then they would be led out into this darkened cylindrical room where the panorama was. If you look at this picture, you can see that there's a large umbrella-like canvas structure up above, and that's to help hide the top edge of the painting. There was naturalistic light coming from skylights to light the painting. And in the space that the visitors were standing in, there was railing to keep them away from the canvas. And that, along with the size of the canvas, put it far into the background, which helped minimize parallax effects. And in addition to all this, there were also foreground elements. So there was ground, there might have been mannequin figures that were appropriate to the scene, and other elements to help bridge and further the illusion between the painting and the viewer. Panoramas became popular throughout Europe, and they also made their way to the Americas. And it's estimated that over 100 million people saw them in the 19th century. Their popularity waxed and waned during that time, but it was also very obvious to the audiences, as well as the critics and the creators of the panoramas, that this was a very powerful tool for virtual tourism. The panorama allowed visitors to really make sense of their urban environments, just because the countries during this time were rapidly industrializing, and there were many people moving into the cities. And so there are panoramas of the cities themselves, often done from an elevated view. The panoramas obviously could be used as a form of virtual tourism of exciting and exotic foreign locations, such as this panorama of the gardens of Versailles in France. This panorama is located in Washington, D.C. today. And then countries also use panoramas as propaganda, as a nationalistic purpose, where they would have a panorama highlighting a particular battle. And in fact, about roughly 1/3 of the British and French panoramas were of battles. And oftentimes, you might even have veterans of those battles on location or at the panorama, and they would tell visitors stories from those battles. In the United States, moving panoramas became popular. And these were panoramas that weren't fixed to a cylindrical space, but were actually unrolled between two vertically standing cylinders. And these were shown to seated audiences. And as the panorama unfurled, a tour guide would give a spoken narration as to what was being seen. So here we have the only surviving panorama showing a journey up or down the Mississippi River in the United States. And this was done by an Irish painter, John Egan, and commissioned by an amateur archaeologist, Wilson Dickerson. And so this panorama consists of 25 scenes. Each panel is 2.5 meters high, just over 4 meters in width, and in total about just over 100 meters, although it was advertised as being 15,000 feet long, or about 4.5 kilometers, which was a marketing hype. And because this was commissioned by an archaeologist, it focused on Indian ruins. Now, we've seen panoramas, which was a mass medium for the 19th century. So now let's look at the invention of the next mass medium of the next century, which is cinema. So towards the end of the 19th century, we now travel to France, where two brothers, Louis and Auguste Lumière, tried to create a motion picture camera that was better than Thomas Edison's kinetograph. The Lumière brothers' cinematograph was hand cranked as opposed to the electrically powered Edison camera. And this particular camera could also be turned into a projector, and it could project the film onto a wall, which allowed the images to be viewed by a larger audience. In contrast, the kinetoscope by Edison was viewable by only one person at a time, who had to view it through a peep show eyepiece. Here is the first film that the Lumière brothers made, which shows workers leaving their factory. The Lumière brothers ran a factory making camera and film equipment. And so you can see it's, to us, it's not a very exciting scene. It's a film that lasts only 50 seconds, so it's relatively short. But the reactions to this film were of complete amazement. So today, we don't think of traditional cinema as being all that immersive, or perhaps even all that realistic, because we know all the fictional conventions that are inherent in that medium. And especially when we compare it to modern forms of immersion, such as virtual reality. But look at what the reactions were to the Lumière brothers film. Georges Méliès, today we know as a pioneering filmmaker who created some of the earliest special effects. And at that time, he was already familiar with creating projections. And these are simply projections of static scenes onto walls. But here he was absolutely stunned by what he had saw. We sat with our mouths open without speaking, filled with amazement, is his quote. And then after Lumiere's film started being shown to the public, here is a quote from a newspaper article at the end of 1895. It points out they see a factory gate which opens and releases a flood of workers, male and female, with bicycles, running dogs, and carriages, all swarming and milling about. It is a life itself. It is movement captured on the spot. So that's what these critics were comparing early film to life itself. Now, I'm sure most of you perhaps are already familiar with the history of motion pictures. So let's jump forward in time another half century to another significant evolution in immersion. And specifically, I'm talking about widescreen film. Widescreen film has been attempted starting for quite a bit of time, starting in the 1920s, but it wasn't until 1952 with Cinerama did this Hollywood come up with a way that was viable alternative to as a way to lure audiences from television. And so Cinerama was invented by Fred Waller, who based it on a World War II invention of his, a flight simulator trainer that was created using 11 film projectors. And instead of 11 projectors, Cinerama only had 3 interlocking 35mm cameras with a resulting field of view on the curved screen of 146 degrees from side to side and 55 degrees up and down. Cinerama theaters had to be specially renovated from existing theaters, or they had to be specially built to accommodate the screen as well as the 3 projection booths. In addition to widescreen visuals, Cinerama also had surround sound. It had 7 tracks of sound with 5 in the front and 2 surround channels. And these sound channels were actively panned by between the speakers by sound engineers. Cinerama's wraparound widescreen images and multi-track stereo sound really pulled audiences into the picture. Audience members felt that they had become active participants, not just passive viewers of the film. And this active experience was often highlighted in the marketing materials. So here you can see pictures of audience members that are superimposed onto Cinerama scenes, including being on a roller coaster or falling over a waterfall or in the air flying over a landscape. Yet a contradiction exists when we examine, let's look at some of the audience reactions from Cinerama. We no longer look at a motion picture, we are the picture. This invention makes the difference between seeing something on a flat page and seeing it in true life. Cinerama does not reproduce such old tricks as the baseball thrown straight into the spectator's laps. Rather, it seems to pull the audience into the picture. So intense is the feeling of realism transmitted by Cinerama that not a few visitors are overcome physically when they ride the roller coaster. We didn't relax our hold on the back of the chair in front of us until the lights came on. A lady a few chairs away didn't look so good. Biggest thing since sound, said a gentleman near us. And then finally, during a roller coaster shot at a preview, ladies shut their eyes and men grabbed their seats to stop swaying. So these are all interesting and amazing quotes about what Cinerama, how people experience Cinerama. But I think there's also a contradiction between these audience reactions and how we might react to it today. And I suspect modern audiences wouldn't have exactly the same reactions, even if they were transported to a Cinerama theater and seeing an original print of the film. And I think that is because the experiences of the past, such as the early films of the Lumière brothers, as well as the Cinerama films, they don't appear as impressive to us because our expectations have changed. And these past reactions seem overblown, and they because these early media experiences don't seem as impressive. So were audiences that different in the past? Probably not. And I think modern audiences are just more used to more sophisticated spectacles, and we've had more visual experiences that are even more amazing. And so our expectations of what amazes us today are very different. And cognitive psychology actually supports the idea that our expectations are important for our perception. So for instance, as we observe the world around us, things that match our expectations are incorporated easily into our mental model of that world, but things that don't belong are less easily incorporated. And our reactions are based on our expectations. And so whether we are transported by immersive experiences depends on expectations of what that sense of presence will be like. If our norm is at a higher level of fidelity for presence or for immersion, then a Lumière film of people walking out of a factory won't meet that expectation, and because they don't meet our current norms. So if we go back to our diagram of the different types of immersion, what our brief history shows is that compelling immersive experiences have been primarily visual, with only a few other senses engaged. And the sense of immersion really comes from the technology, from that system immersion. Yet for the most part, we also find that narrative immersion is an extremely important component of many of such experiences, especially in the Sacro Monte or in narrative film, and that narrative immersion can be an extremely powerful draw for audiences. And we can see examples where having technologically based immersion has failed in the past. So Morton Heilig, who I mentioned earlier, invented what was the first virtual reality ride, the Sensorama. And this ride, unfortunately, failed to attract attention. Heilig invented this after being inspired by Cinerama. And instead of simply being engaged by sights and sounds, he wanted to engage all of the senses. That included the sense of touch as well as the sense of smell. And so he created the Sensorama, which was a motorcycle ride through a city as well as country roads. And Heilig was able to install the Sensorama in a New York City arcade, but it turned out to be too complicated and required constant repairs. And so it never really made much money. And attempts to get investments from Hollywood studios also became a failure. And partially that might have been because during the 1950s, Hollywood was experimenting with early 3D films and technologies like pumping odors into theaters. And all these gimmicks ended up being unsuccessful. And so they didn't want another gimmicky ride. And so I think, in a way, what the studio people sensed was that their films already were bringing audiences in. And so they, in our terminology that I've been using in this talk, they were able to bring that level of narrative immersion. And it wasn't necessary to increase the technological immersion, the system immersion any further and further complicate things. And so unfortunately, Heilig's ideas and his dreams for even more sophisticated technologies like his experience theater never evolved further than the patent drawings, which he patented in 1969. And his experience theater was an immersive theater that had seats that were raked, very similar to a modern digital planetarium or the OmniMax theaters that came in the 1970s. And the people seated at these seats, they sat on motion bases that allowed the seats to rock and to move. And they had fans that would simulate wind and to blow odors into their faces. And I think today we see kind of a similar situation in the world of virtual reality. In the last couple of years, there has been more and more press that have wondered whether virtual reality or augmented reality, whether that has failed. And that's just because the virtual reality hasn't succeeded as measured in sales to match up the expectations that promoters have been setting. And so if we look at some of the headlines, why is virtual reality failing to take off again? Virtual reality will take big steps forward in 2019. This was an article published early in 2019, but will anyone care? And finally, in late 2018, there was a report on augmented and virtual reality. And specifically in this article, it points out that even a highly touted technology like Magic Leap felt completely underwhelming once it finally appeared to be tested by the public. So Magic Leap was a disappointing success as part of this headline. And even this year, in 2020, when more people were stuck at home under quarantine, we might expect virtual reality headsets to, sales to increase. And unfortunately, we'll probably have to wait until early next year to find out if this is the case. But even with this hasn't stopped griping by journalists and other writers. So back in April, this New York Times writer asked, this should be virtual reality's moment. Why is it still so niche? And then just a couple months ago, this article by Ben Kuchera, The Virtual Reality Revolution, has been 5 minutes away for 8 years. What keeps virtual reality stuck in the future? And I think for the public, part of this is the added expense and hassle that is involved with using virtual reality. So as pointed out by Ben Kuchera in this Polygon article, he subtly points out that most head-mounted displays and virtual reality technologies and media are developed mostly by men. And so it doesn't occur to many of the developers that a significant portion of the population don't want their hair or their makeup messed up by putting on tight-fitting goggles and a very tight strap on top. And this added hassle means that overcoming, if you make improvements in virtual reality, other types of improvements, but don't improve in the ease of use, the wider public still might not want or be interested in VR because simply increasing the technological capabilities isn't enough for them. And so I think our final lessons for immersive experiences today, coming from this history that we've looked at, are the following. First, audiences may be happy with narrative immersion of current technologies. And so that means this is enough to keep audiences engaged. And that means television and film theaters, whenever they might open again after the pandemic, those are perfectly acceptable to most people since the storytelling is already extremely engaging, while the costs of watching TV or film is extremely low. You just simply turn it on and you sit down. And now compare it to the costs of virtual reality, which is much more complex and much more of a hassle. And so immersive experience developers should definitely consider audience expectations, since increasing the technology, increasing the system immersion may not be a compelling way compared to the time and costs that are involved with these immersive experiences. And so instead, the audience might be perfectly happy with the narrative immersion that they currently enjoy, which more than compensates for the extra expense and hassle of the increased system immersion that is possible with the new technology. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you for viewing my presentation.
Gracias por acompañarnos. Sigan atentos la agenda académica del festival en la página web www.realmix.gov.co.